Hello, my name's Holly. I'm a game designer. I run a tiny company called Matheson Marco with my friend Sophie, and we make games that have some sort of presence in the physical world. So this is a game I made back when I worked at a company called Hide and Seek. This is a game that I worked on a choreographer called Brian Hartley with. Basically things where people manifest in the real world and do stuff physically with their actual bodies. This is a thing I made late last year as part of a festival called East Durham Creates, which was a game where we went around to 6 different locations around East Durham, a shopping centre and a couple of community centres and a couple of parks, and the Victor Passmore Pavilion. This is the Victor Passmore Pavilion, and made up little site-specific playgroundy games that people could just play wherever they were without any special equipment with the friends that they happened to have with them. This is also the Victor Passmore Pavilion. So the Victor Passmore Pavilion is a grade 2 star listed building, which is like being a grade 2 listed building except even more special. It's also some sort of grade 2 listed park, so it's simultaneously both of those at once. And so the bit where we had to convince the council that it would be okay for us to write the rules for some games that we'd made up in paint that was definitely removable. By going to the pavilion, painting on a patch of it, that's not our paint, by the way, that is the paint of the dead famous artist Victor Passmore, who also painted on the pavilion, but it's fine, it was his pavilion, he was allowed to. Waited for it to dry for half an hour and then scrubbed it off, going, we've technically tested this before, we're told this will definitely come off, and waited to find out if it didn't, if we'd be allowed to go on with the project. Was slightly unnerving. It's one of the things about making physical games. Another of the things about making physical games, and the things that I'm going to be talking about today, is risk assessments. This is a risk assessment. This is part of a risk assessment for an event that I ran at the Wellcome Collection not very long ago. As you'll see, these are lines number 77 through to 84. This is maybe halfway through the risk assessment document. Some of these risk assessments are, quite fun to think about. There's a game called Sext Machine, and we had to think about, is there a risk that people will actually take sexy photographs rather than taking innocuous photographs of things that they think a computer will believe is sexy? And so we dealt with that by putting it somewhere relatively bright and out in the open and hard to be secretive around. But some of them are just, the equipment might catch on fire, to which the thing to do in response to that is always get it PAT tested, which stands for Portable Appliance Testing. So it is one of those ATM machine style acronyms that doesn't quite work. So the thing that you can't see up the top of there is the headings, which are something like name of game, thing that might happen, how bad the thing that might happen is, the chances of that thing that might happen actually happening, and what we can do to reduce the chances of the thing that might happen happening. This is a fairly standard way to do a risk assessment form. There's another way that I occasionally encounter, which I prefer, which is this grid. This is not from one of my events. This is a generic example of a risk assessment grid you might have to fill out if you wanted to do something in Jubilee Square in Brighton. And the way these ones work is a bit different. For every single risk, you have to give it a score between 1 and 5 for how likely it is to happen. That's very unlikely at 1, unlikely, likely at 3, very likely at 4, and certain at 5. And then you give it another score from 1 to 5 for severity. 1, minor injury, no time off. 2, injury and up to 3 days off. 3, reportable condition. 4, major injury or long-term absence. 5, death. And if you're filling in one of these sorts of risk assessments, which the South Bank Centre, for example, has this sort, what you do is you give the scores, so 1 through 5 for each of these things, and then you multiply them together to get your risk total, which I think is better, because with the first way, you just say, this is a risk, this is how bad it is, and then what can I do to reduce it, regardless of how bad the risk really is. Whereas this way, you get a number, a nice number telling you. You can see 1 to 8 is a low risk. Usually with a low risk you can just go ahead and do the thing. 9 to 15 is a medium risk. Usually that's don't do this except very occasionally when you really need to and make sure you're paying a lot of attention. And 16 to 25 is a high risk and you should never, never, never do those. Which seems quite stringent, but if you look at the numbers, you can see that, 2 by 4 is an 8, which is a low risk, and you're allowed to go ahead with it. So something where it's unlikely but possible that there'll be a major injury is still technically a low risk, and it's all okay. So let's go back to the Passmore Pavilion briefly. When I went to the Passmore Pavilion, I did the thing which I get to do for quite a lot of my job, which is great, which is stand in a strange place and go, what would be fun here? What could people do that would be interesting that they can do in this place and they can't do in any other place? And then while I was sitting there thinking, some 12-year-old boys came out of their respective homes, and one of them was dragging a couple of lounge chair cushions, and one of them was dragging a couple of others, and one of them was dragging a mattress, and they went and put those on a green bank that you can't quite see, just out of shot to the right, and they put them in a big pile, and then they climbed up the pavilion, and then they jumped off onto them. And then they moved them up onto the top of the pavilion and climbed onto the roof of it and jumped down onto that. And they spent half an hour moving this pile of makeshift lounge chair pillows around and around and jumping down onto them. That's a fun thing you can do in that space that you can't do in anything else. Unfortunately, it would not pass risk assessment, so I had to stick to slightly less exciting games. What I'm going to go and do now is talk very briefly through some games from history, which I think are super, super interesting, but which I will never, ever, ever be able to curate into an event because they simply do not pass risk assessment. So, for example, Snapdragon. Snapdragon is a game that was really, really big during 19th century English Christmases. You can see a family sitting around staring at the game of Snapdragon in the centre. You can see the children looking a bit appalled. In some cases, see that little boy on the right there, clearly crying. That's because the way you play Snapdragon is to get a big, big, shallow metal plate, and you scatter raisins in it and also some 2p pieces. And then you pour brandy over the whole thing, and then you set the brandy alight, and then going around the table, you take it in turns to grab something out of the platter. And if it's a raisin, you can put it in your mouth and it will get extinguished reasonably quickly, probably, you hope, and that'll be okay. But a 2p piece is worth quite a lot if you're a tiny, tiny child in the 19th century. So maybe you want the 2p piece, right? Risk and reward, it's good game design. But unfortunately, it's not a game that I'm ever going to be able to run at an event. Yeah, you can sort of sit there and try and think through ways to make it safe, and it's probably not going to work out. Okay. So there's other games that also I'm not going to be able to show. There's a game that's reported in some of Peter Ackroyd's histories of Britain. Britain is particularly big on these games, or perhaps it's just they're just more thoroughly documented in languages I can read. Apprentices during the Middle Ages were really big on a game called Breaking Doors with Our Heads. The rules of this game are not recorded anywhere, so I cannot perform a thorough risk assessment of it. But again, I'm willing to bet that probably I can't include it in any of my events. Split the Kipper is another one. This is kind of from 60s Glasgow and Scotland and Northern England in particular, but it is reported elsewhere. This is a comment from somebody talking about having played it in the 1980s and how, according to this person, the fact that Split the Kipper was playable in the 80s and would not be allowed now is proof that the 1950s to the 1980s are the best era. The way you play Split the Kipper is this. You're a small child and you're on a break from school, and so you go out to the playground, and because it's, the 50s or whatever it might be, one of you has a small knife. So you and your partner stand opposite each other with your feet together, maybe a couple of paces away from each other, and you take turns to flick the knife on the outside of each other's feet. So you don't want to hit the feet, that would be bad, And you don't want to get between the feet because that's called splitting the kipper and it gives your opponent an advantage. What you want to do is get it within about 1.5 knife's length of the player's feet on the outside of the feet, because what they then have to do is move their foot to where the knife is, bend down, pick it up, and then throw it back at your foot. And you both get more and more ungainly as you go on, and eventually one of you will fall over and the other person wins. If you throw it between the other person's feet instead, that's called splitting the kipper. They're allowed to stand back up and put their feet together, and you've basically lost. In some variants of the game, if you split the kipper, you then have to turn around and throw through your legs. So again, this is a game that has some charming elements to it, but also some elements that are not going to... Yeah, there's suggestions that you can make this safe by playing with sticks, which is sort of fine, but it doesn't actually work, because part of the point of it is you need to have the skill to get the knife to land, point first and stick in the ground, whereas with sticks that's never going to work out. So you can't really make a version of this game that keeps the core gameplay and is safe to play. Rhubarb thrashing and marrow dangling, and I'm going to run through some of these quite quickly. Rhubarb thrashing is a game where two players get blindfold, lie on the ground, hold hands, and in their other hand they have a pile of rhubarb, and they hit each other till one of them gives up. This seems like the sort of thing that you go, oh, isn't it quaint? It's been done since the 1600s and there's a village where it still happens. But no, like a pub landlord sometime in the mid-century made this up and convinced everyone it was a good idea, and somehow it's still a thing that is occasionally done. Rhubarb leaves are poisonous, so the solution to that is you take the rhubarb leaves off, but there is no solution to the bit where you are still blindfolded hitting each other with some sticks. Okay. The Mesoamerican ball game, this is amazing, and I can't really go into too much detail about it. I could talk about this for, 20 minutes. But this is a game where no one really understands the rules anymore, but it's been played for 3,500 years in some form. And as far as people can figure out, the way it worked was, you have this massive ball court. You have two teams of 2 or 4 players. You have a big rubber ball that weighs up to 7 or 8 pounds, and it's really, really dense and really, really hard to move around. You are not allowed to touch it with your hands. You have to elbow it and hit it with your hips in particular. This is mostly a hip-based ball game. And you're trying to keep the ball in the air, and you're trying to get it from one side to the other. There's also, if you're particularly skilled, you might be able to make up high on the walls there, a sort of a horizontally aligned stone loop. And if you can manage to get the ball through those using, I remind you, your hip, and it's quite high up, then you essentially get an instant win. It's a sort of golden snitch equivalent. And so there's various issues with this game, but it was really, really, really important to life in parts of, Mesoamerica 3,000 years ago. And there's stories about how important that was. There's a story of the hero twins, who are, in a load of the mythology of the time, going to play the Lords of Chibalba, the Lords of the Underworld, at this game, and it almost going terribly wrong because the Lords of the Underworld are untrustworthy, and they secretly replace the ball with a ball of their own making made up of deadly bone knives that go out of it when the game's going to be played. But the hero twins figure this out, and they distract the Lords of the Underworld with chasing after a rabbit, and they replace it with a ball that's safe, and it all turns out okay. So there's various things you can do to make this a safe game to play. Firstly, you make sure you are not playing against the Lords of the Underworld. And secondly, you give your players protective clothing. The protective clothing of the time was a stone belt, or occasionally a wooden belt, which would apparently make the bruises less bad, although it seems frankly unlikely to me. How am I doing for time? I have another 2 minutes, gosh. Okay, Bradgerak. This is an Indigenous Australian game. It's a bit like hide and seek, but you are only allowed to hide in wombat holes. Wombats are pretty big. That's a wombat. The difficult bit of this is that once you've hidden in the wombat hole, you cannot get out again because they're not that big, so everyone else has to find you and dig you out. Otherwise, you lose the game, and there are also other problems that you may eventually encounter. And I don't think there's a way to make that safe, because part of the joy of it, right, is hiding in the wombat hole. Dueling. Dueling is super well designed as a game. It has lots and lots of interesting bits and pieces. But again, the fact that it's dangerous and you might die is part of the core of it. But there are some weird things, like when you switch from swords to pistols, by some reports it actually gets safer. Because when you're fighting with a sword, you know, your excitement level is up and you don't really go, let's take a step back from this and think about exactly what we're doing. Whereas if you've got a pistol and you have to reload it after every shot that's failed and think about it and then go, nope, I'm not going to apologise, I'm going to keep on with this thing where my ex-friend and I shoot at each other on, you know, in Hyde Park at 6 a.m. in the morning. Yes, I want to do this again. People are more likely to stop, and then they're more likely to not die. But when people did die from duels, pistol-based duels, it was often not because of the shot directly, but because fabric got carried into the wounds and then got infected later. So there's a case of a doctor from Brighton turning up to a duel stark naked because he thought that would give him more chance of survival. No fabric to be carried into the wound, right? In a way, he was right, because his opponent refused to fight him. He thought that the nakedness was making a farce out of this thing where two grown men would get up at 4 in the morning and then go and stand in a wood with their friends nearby and shoot at each other because one of them had bumped into the other at a dance. So, in conclusion, I'm probably never going to be able to run a festival of all of my famous historical games, because much though I enjoy and value filling out risk assessment forms, there's just too many games that wouldn't make it through. Thank you.